Greetings, fellow storytellers. Raikai here with Right to the Point, Episode 1. In this, I'm going to be explaining the different aspects of storytelling, from its basic plot points, to character development, to audience, to execution. And first, I guess, we should begin with the basics. The basics of storytelling can be broken down into 4 different sections: audience, consistency, atmosphere, and delivery. Within them you have all your different subtexts. But with the first one is audience, and probably the most key in any of this. You may have a great story and a wonderful atmosphere, and you may deliver it wonderfully, but if you're talking to a wall, then that's all you have. When you're talking about your audience, you have to keep in mind who is your audience when you're telling a story. Let's use the MPAA ratings, for example. Now, you've got a story that will be technically PG-13. It's not exactly that bad, and maybe children can see it with their parents. However, if you start to delve into more dangerous territory, explicit sexual conduct, swearing, or graphic violence, then you have to kind of sit and rethink about who your audience is exactly without incurring the wrath of some very angry parents. Lord knows we've seen that problem too many times in the local theaters. The other problem that a lot of stories have these days, in particular, is consistency. What's the pace of your story? If you start out with a story that promises to be action-filled, and then there seems to be a very long, slow, middle part, you lose your audience. They don't want to pay attention, they look at their watch or start texting somebody else. It's the same thing that's applied to books or webcomics. If you have a lot of filler, a lot of padding, and it's not entertaining, then you might as well just stop altogether. The third is atmosphere. If you can get your audience to fall in love with the world that you've created, at least that's something. Even if they don't like the characters, you've at least got them hooked to see more of this world. A good example would probably be James Cameron's Avatar, as much as I know I'm going to have people disagreeing with me on that. Yes, it is a very basic story, but it was the world that sucked most of us in. Between its floating rocks and strange creatures, I wanted to see more, personally. Number 4 is delivery. How do you tell your story? What is the medium that you choose? And Lord knows that there are countless mediums today in this world. You've got books on tape, you've got actual books, you've got movies, you've got webcomics, you've got web series. You have so many different options for telling a story. You even still have the old balladeer version, especially with a group that does Proto-Men, which was their interpretation of Mega Man, and the story there afterwards. In this case, we've got stories. Any basic story, any simple story can be broken down into 3 very general concepts: your beginning or the introduction of your conflict, the climax, and the resolution. If your story cannot be broken down in those 3 elements, then you probably have to rethink your story and try to see if you can find those elements. Because if you don't have that, you have no tension, and therefore your audience has absolutely no reason to follow this story. But in this case, storytelling goes as far back as the caveman. With the paintings in caves, cavemen used to believe that they were magical, that there was literally no border between them and the nature that surrounded them. And as it was passed down before writing was developed, stories were told orally, and they were carried down and they were remembered through generations because of its delivery, because of its characters, because of its audience, and its consistency. The first written epic, as far back as we can tell, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written back in Babylon 3,000 years ago. And that depicts the story of a man who was born 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, and was, for all intents and purposes, a crap king. But with the creation of Enkidu, he was his balancing force. So the first written story was actually a buddy story, as it goes through the evolution of Gilgamesh as a more well-rounded man, and Enkidu becoming more civilized, as he lived in the woods as a wild man and some interesting plot things. If you're really interested in figuring out this story, I suggest you read it for yourself. It is a very good epic, but there are just some things I can't mention here in that epic. And yes, there is homoeroticism in this story, but a lot of the myths, if you notice, in ancient civilizations seem to be that way. And that's not to bash on it, it's simply saying is that that was the cultural thing until, heck, I think that was socially acceptable. Probably the 11th century, 1100s, 1200s. Afterwards, having male suitors was not necessarily a thing that society smiled upon. But anyways, I'm getting on a tangent. Now, in this case, written story is sometimes the most difficult, because the fact is that if you have a particular picture in your mind, it's hard to try to describe that. But if you keep the four things in mind: audience, who's your target audience, consistency, what's the pace of your story, atmosphere, what kind of a world are you trying to get your audience into, and delivery, how you tell this story, it could be the difference between something like Shakespeare and, oh, I don't know, Twilight perhaps? This is Raikai with Right to the Point Episode 1, saying sayonara and good luck on your stories. Next week, the characteristics that make a good story.